Hello, my name is Johnny McClure. I'm a member and a deacon here at Huntington Missionary Baptist Church. My wife Janet and I have taken on a little preservation project to capture interviews with pastors and deacons and lay people here in West Tennessee of our Missionary Baptist churches. This is the second in a series. We hope to be a series. Our first video was back in May of 2020 that we did with Brother Ray Smith during the beginning of the pandemic. Today we are very honored, privileged to have a very special lady at our church, Sister Ann Ridings, or as we call her, Miss Ann. So she'll be number 2 of our series of interviews. And we're very tickled to have Miss Ann here with us this morning. Miss Ann, good morning.
Good morning, Johnny.
How are you?
I'm just wonderful today. It's a beautiful day. Why shouldn't we be great?
Beautiful day. Beautiful Lord's day, isn't it? Well, and before I go any further, let me thank our good videographer, our producer, my sweet wife, Miss Janet, or as we call her, Sister Sweetie. So at this point, Miss Ann, what do you think of our project that me and Janet are undertaking?
Well, I think it's great. I think it's really great. I think it's something that will be really good historically for missionary Baptist churches, for our church in particular, since you're initiating this. And it's something that, if we can think back, how wonderful it would be to see an interview with some of our past pastors and lay people and people who have been strong in the faith and that we admire. So I believe this is the beginning of something that I hope that you can continue on.
Well, that's our desire and that's our hope. And when this project first started, at least in my mind, I was thinking about, can you imagine being able to sit down and watch an interview with Brother Fred Prince or Brother Harold Carver, 2 gentlemen that have long been gone but were very strong missionary Baptist ministers in our faith here in West Tennessee. And that's kind of prompted this little project. But anyway, today we've got Miss Ann here, and she has a wealth of history and knowledge of the Missionary Baptist Church, especially here at Huntington Missionary Baptist. We're just thrilled to have her.
Thank you, Jack.
So let's just get started. Miss Ann, tell us a little bit about where you were born and raised.
Well, I was born in a little town called Yuma. And around here, they're familiar with Yuma.
Yuma?
Yuma. And my father was a merchant there, and Mr. Will Kirksey. And he and my mother raised me up in Missionary Baptist Church. Praise the Lord. So I was taken to church ever since I've been in this world, by my mother and my father. My father was a deacon at New Hope. And in fact, back then we only had church once a month because the pastors were overloaded. The pastors had to pastor 3 or 4 churches, and it was hard to get one that could go full-time. And another thing, the people back then couldn't afford to pay a pastor full-time,
Right.
like they can today. Most of them were farmers. They had to eke out their living the best way they could and barely get by paying for a family. But back then, you'd pay a preacher with a ham of meat or a chicken or a bag of corn or, something like that. But anyway, the men of God back then really had to put out an effort because they had to make their living, work, and study to bring God's Word.
We have the luxury today, obviously, of being able to travel long distances in a short period of time with the cars we have and the good roads we have. But back then, I suspect a 5-mile trip to church was a pretty good trip.
Yes.
What are some of your first memories of church as a little girl?
Well, when you first asked me about that, and I saw that that question might come up, I began to think, and in my memory, it's very precious. I remember first going to New Hope Church. My dad, of course, was a deacon there. And as I said, he and Mom were involved in the church. So I remember the revivals especially. The church would be full of people. There weren't ball games and television and sports events and things like that to take our minds away from church. And it was a place you see your neighbors and get acquainted, and the fellowship was wonderful. You got to know everybody. But I can remember the church, especially during revival, being absolutely full and running over, and of course no air conditioning, but the windows would be up and the breeze would be coming through, and there'd even be an overflow of people out in the churchyard looking in at the windows. I remember the altar would be full of people seeking the Lord, young people and middle-aged people. And I remember the little ladies with their ankle-length dresses down in the altar, and the gentlemen with their long white beards down on their knees, pouring their heart out to God for those sinners.
Sure.
And it's such a beautiful, sweet memory. It's a shame we can't see something like that these days.
It sure is.
But that's one of my first memories.
Who was the first minister or pastor that you remember as a little girl?
Probably Brother A.U. Nunnery. I just loved that man. I was a little bitty girl, but I remember I just loved that Brother Nunnery. And I remember I went up one day after church and I said, "Brother Nunnery, I want you to preach my funeral." I was just a little girl. He said, "Well, darling, if I'm living, I sure will." But of course, I was just a little bitty girl, and I have outlived him. But I loved him so much. But he's one of the first ones I remember.
So did Brother Nunnery have multiple churches that he pastored?
Yes, he did.
Kind of like, I guess today some of the smaller Methodist churches have circuit preachers where they'll service 2 or 3 or 4.
Well, it was similar to
churches.
something like that. It's,
Right.
that they did have several churches. But my dad, although we had church just once a month, he was used to going to church. He had moved from Oklahoma. He lived here, moved to Oklahoma, then he came back. And he was used to having church every Sunday, and he wanted church. So he started Sunday school
Really?
at New Hope.
Really?
So we would have somewhere to go and study the Word on Sunday.
I did not know that. So you've already said that y'all had church just once a month, but your father had started Sunday school every Sunday. What other denominations would have been in Yuma at that time in the community?
Well, I believe there was a Church of Christ at that time. I can't remember for sure because at that time I wasn't particularly interested in other churches. But I believe there may have been a Methodist in the community and maybe a Church of Christ. But now I can't remember for sure. My memory's not really good on that.
Who was the greater influence on you spiritually, your mother or your father, or both of them about the same?
Well, both of them. I admired and respected my father. He was quite a bit older than my mother. I think about 25, 30 years older than mother. And of course, he was always had something to do in the church, and and so did mother. But I guess in growing up, they probably both had equal influence on me. But later in life, my mother became a real influence. Possibly even before that. My dad was an invalid for several years. And I know Mother would read from the Bible to him. and that's when she started. I guess she would have been in her probably 40s at that time. She would read the Bible, and she started then reading the Bible through every year. But she started out by reading to my dad because he was sick, and they both had trouble sleeping at night, so she would read the Bible to him. And that started that practice of reading it. But they both were a spiritual blessing to me, possibly later in life, my mother.
Well, I'm glad you brought your mother up, Miss Opal, as we all affectionately knew her. We're going to talk about her a little bit later, actually.
Okay.
But talk about your first experience being convicted, first time you were convicted of your sins, and from there go into when you were saved, and talk a little bit about that.
All right, and forgive me if I get a little teary.
Oh, we got plenty of tissues.
Can't tell. Well, I brought my hanky with me.
We got plenty of tissues.
Women don't do that these days, but I
Yeah.
brought my hanky with me. As I said, we were always going to church. Well, at this particular time, we lived in McKenzie, and we belonged to, or Mom and Dad belonged to Caledonia Missionary Baptist Church. And Brother Clarence Carter at this particular time happened to be our pastor. So one day church was over, and I missed my mom. I went out to the car, and I thought, well, Mom's not here. Dad was talking to somebody. So I walked back into the church, and everybody had gone except Mom and Brother Carter. And they were standing up in the pulpit area. And Mother was standing there with tears rolling down her eyes. And I heard her say, they didn't know I was there listening. I was at the back of the church. And she said, Brother Carter, I want you to help me pray that when Ann comes to the age of accountability, that she'll be saved. And so when she said those words, it was just like an arrow had been shot into my heart. From that moment, I knew, there's something bad wrong with me.
Right.
I didn't tell anybody about that experience, but we went on home, and then I'm not sure how long after that. That was in the back of my mind, but I didn't discuss it with anybody. But in March of 1946, a neighbor of ours was holding a Bible school in their home. They were Presbyterians. And the lady that was holding it was a Presbyterian lady, Mrs. Snodgrass. I'll never forget that name, because to me it was odd at that time, Miss Snodgrass. But I attended that little Bible school with my other friends. And one day at Bible school, we were sitting there, and she said, do any of you feel like you need to be saved? Oh, my hand went up immediately. And from that point on, I couldn't tell you if there was another child in that room.
Really?
I was sitting on the couch. I can see it in my mind as clearly as sitting here. I was sitting on the couch, and Miss Snodgrass came over to me and sat down. And she opened her Bible, and she began to read to me about the crucifixion of Christ. All that was there at that particular moment was me and that voice reading about Christ and taking me back to Calvary. And I could see him on the cross, just as plain as I see you right now. I was taken to Calvary, and I know people think that's my imagination, but in my mind, I was at Calvary, and I was looking up at Christ before me on the cross, and the blood was streaming down the cross. And I thought, he did this for me. this is what he did for me. And just suddenly, that quickly, everything happened. That burden was gone. I looked out the window. Well, I usually wonder, window, it was the door, but it had those little windows in it, and it looked like the leaves in the trees were just clapping their hands for joy. I've heard people say that, but it did. Everything was brighter. That burden was lifted, and I knew I had been saved.
How old were you at that time?
I was 12 years old.
12 years old.
March the 14th, 1946. I can't always remember that date. In fact, I looked it up today to make sure. To make sure, because I had written it my first thing. Dad bought me a Bible of my own after I was saved, and I had written in the back of it, I was saved on March 14th, 1946. And that house is gone now. But in my mind, I can go right back to that place. But I know, I met the Lord that day.
Sure.
But there was a little caveat to that. I don't remember, but it may have been, I think it was that very night. Well, let me back up a little bit. Miss Snodgrass went home with me to tell my mom, we were going to tell my mom that I had been saved. And of course, she always wanted to make so sure, and we all do. We want our children to be sure that they have really been saved. So after Miss Snodgrass left, she said, "Ann, are you sure? Are you sure that's what happened?" "Oh, yes, Mom, I know. I know it is." Well, that night, as I lay in my bed, I was looking out through the window at that big, beautiful moon, and I was praying. And I got so happy, I couldn't stay in the bed. I got up, I went in to Mom and Dad, and I said, "I've got to go tell," my half-brother lived next door over there, and I said, "I've got to go tell them." They said, "You can tell them tomorrow," But I was so happy, I was just bubbling over. My fountain was overflowing. So he's been with me ever since. I know I met him right there.
Sure. So how long do you think you were under conviction? You said you were saved at 12.
Not very long. I never did go up to the altar, and that was in March. And I don't know, as I said, I don't remember. I probably wasn't very long. I tried to think back to when we were at church, and I was, I don't believe it was, seems like it was warm weather that they were, that it was either spring or summer or something. It might have been weeks, it may have been months, but I can't tell you how long it was. But that conviction stayed in the back of my mind. It wasn't oppressive, but I knew it was there, so that when somebody mentioned it to me, I immediately spoke up.
Right. Did you join the church then at New Hope, or what happened?
No, I joined at Caledonia. I couldn't wait to join the church. And there's a little tale about that, if you don't mind, I'll tell you. I joined the church, couldn't wait to join the church. So I joined the church, told my experience and everything. And that was in March, in July of March. And, or July of March, I beg your pardon. July of 46. They set a time to be baptized, but it came about in a way that I was disappointed with. After I had joined the church, another young lady during the revival in July had gotten saved. So when they had it baptizing after the revival, her mother and father brought it up to the church and wanted Brother L.H. Brown to baptize her because he was a dear friend and they thought so much of him, and I didn't know the man. So they voted to go ahead and let him come to baptize her, and Ann's got to be baptized too. She can just be baptized at the same time. I wanted Brother Carter to baptize me.
Was Brother Carter the minister at Caledonia at the time?
Yes, he's the one, and of course, he was the minister when my mother was speaking to him, and that was at
Right.
Caledonia. So he was our pastor, and he was the pastor when I joined, and I wanted him to baptize me. But I didn't say anything about it. I was a little 12-year-old girl. I went along with what everybody else said. But to this day, I have been disappointed with my baptism. And several times afterward, I have mentioned to Brother Carter that I was really unhappy with my baptism because I wanted him to baptize me. He said, "Ann, don't you worry a bit about that. You were biblically baptized." He was a minister, and the church gave permission to do it. He said, "You were baptized."
Sure.
But I was always disappointed with it. I've heard so many people say that their baptism was a really wonderful experience for them. But mine wasn't. I don't remember a lot about it.
Well, without getting on to me very much, I was baptized on Easter Sunday at Maple Creek Lake, and it was very cold.
Was it?
It was very cold, but I was not cold the first bit. I didn't get cold a bit. The pastor, that Brother Randall Woods, that baptized me, he may have gotten cold, but I was not cold. I was soaking wet, come out of the water, and the wind was blowing, but I wasn't cold a bit.
Well, see, I wanted an experience like that. I wanted to feel that spirit, but I don't remember feeling that spiritual difference.
Were you baptized
In Coldwater Creek.
in Coldwater? That was my next question. Where were you baptized? Coldwater Creek, which I assume is around the church.
It's fairly close to Caledonia.
Okay. Moving forward a little bit in time, you worked in Nashville for a long time, correct? When you moved, say, from West Tennessee to Nashville and worked, I assume you went to church in and around Nashville.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about the churches that you attended while living and working all those years in Nashville. Were you able to find a church like the way we believe in the Missionary Baptist faith, or was it harder at that time? Or talk a little bit about that.
Yes, now this was in the 80s when I was transferred to Nashville and moved there. And I had a friend who had a sister that lived here that got us acquainted, and we became fast friends after that. And she was going to Two Rivers. If you'll remember, that used to be the church right across from Opryland over there, and it was just a small distance from where I lived. So I went to church with her and enjoyed the Sunday school tremendously. It was a singles class, men and women, but singles, and a fairly large group for that of 30, 35, something like that. Just a nice group, and I loved Sunday school. But when we went to church, it was sort of like going to a theater with a big production. They had an orchestra, of course, and singers, and huge amount of people. And so you sort of just felt like you were in a big theater. And the music was wonderful, and I enjoyed the pastor. At that time, he was very popular, I think. Later on, he fell out of favor, and finally the church dissolved, but that was much later. But during that, of course, me, with my loud mouth, I'm in a Sunday school class, I'm going to speak up and say what I think about certain things. I've never been ashamed or embarrassed about speaking up in Sunday school.
Really? I don't know that I've ever noticed that about you, Miss Ann.
Oh, you haven't been in Sunday school with me. So naturally, I would speak up. Well, they decided they'd like to have me for the teacher, but I wasn't a member of the church. And
Was your membership still at Caledonia at that time?
no, he was here.
Oh.
I was here when the church was organized.
Well, we've skipped a whole discussion that we may have to go back to. then.
Well, we can insert that later if you want to. So I thought, well, I'm up here on weekends now. They want me to teach, and I'd love to teach. So I joined Two Rivers. It's never something that I really wanted to do or felt led to do. It was something that I wanted to do, I guess, because I did enjoy teaching that class. And we had a wonderful class, and I enjoyed that very much, and I thoroughly enjoyed teaching those people, and they seemed to like my teaching. So that's one reason that I took my membership there.
Well, let's, you're talking about inserting that later. Why don't we just do that right now?
Okay.
Of course, Miss Ann and I, our sister Ann, we were both obviously members here at Huntington Missionary Baptist Church. But talk about, did you go directly from Caledonia to Huntington Missionary Baptist? A little backstory, Huntington Missionary Baptist, or HMBC as we call it, to abbreviate it, was formed in 1950. And an interview I did with Brother Ray that I spoke to a little bit in the beginning of this video, we talked about that quite a bit. It was 1950, and were you and your parents living here close to Huntington at that time? Talk a little bit about that.
Okay. Yes, we were living actually just right up Lexington Street here, not very far from here. We had moved there, and that's when Dad got really sick. And let's see, while we were there, Mr. Townsend and Brother Knowles, and there were one or two more gentlemen, were going through the neighborhood asking if there would be, if we'd be interested in organizing a Baptist church here. It's some who did not really or weren't interested in going to First Baptist, but would like to have an old-fashioned missionary Baptist church. And of course, that's what Mom and Dad were. And so they became interested, and they began talking, and throughout the neighborhood, they would visit with people, and there were a group of people who would love to have a church where they could worship like they felt they used to worship. And so Mom and Dad were interested in that, and so Brother Knowles was mainly responsible for organizing that effort.
Can I stop you or interrupt you? That was Brother Robert Knowles?
Brother Robert Knowles.
And you said a Brother Townsend. I don't think I've ever heard that name before.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of his first name, and I can't.
Was he a minister or just a regular lay person?
No, he was a neighbor. He was just a lay person. But they lived in this neighborhood. At that time, Ray Smith lived just down the street here.
Right.
And the Carries, Claude and Minnie Carey, and Walter, and what was his wife's name? Walter, and I can't remember, and Betty Sue Carey, she was their daughter. All those Careys lived down here. They were interested in it. And then I can't tell you all of the members yet. I would have to, and we could research that and bring it in if you wanted to put down the people who were here that organized the church.
Well, I feel like we should probably, Janet and I should probably do one series or one interview at least just concerning
The organization of this
the
church.
organization of Huntington Missionary Baptist Church, which then was known as Independent
Right.
Missionary Baptist Church, located here on Lexington Street in Huntington, Tennessee. But go ahead, Miss Ann.
Okay. So the day came, and we met. We started meeting for church, actually, in a garage just down the street on Lexington Street. Somebody had an old garage out there that they weren't using. So they said we could use that to meet at. And they had just fixed plank boards for seats in there. And so we met there for services and began the effort of organizing a church. I remember the day it was organized. Now, Mom and Dad had already gotten their letter from Caledonia, but I, for some reason or other, didn't ask for mine. I guess I was so used to Caledonia I didn't want to leave. But anyway, I didn't get my letter. But Mom and Dad did. And they met down there on this day, and I'll never forget that. Brother Hersey Hopper preached the organizational sermon. And I was so impressed by him and by the information that he gave, because he traced the Baptist church, the genealogy, you might say, of the Baptist church down all through the ages till you got to Christ time and John. And it fascinated me that they could run that genealogy, like who was in this church that was organized and who baptized him and what church was he from and who baptized him and who are the genealogy ran back like that. And I thought that was so interesting. But by that time I was becoming pretty instaunched in the Baptist church. I was getting, that was my thing,
Right.
my Baptist church. Okay, after it was organized, then there was an effort to build a church. So they began to gather their money together and get enough together, and there were several men who were carpenters, and they did a lot of the work themselves. And I guess you've seen the picture out here of the
Sure.
old church
Sure.
that they built. And of course, through the years, it was added to now and then. They finally bricked, and I know at the first we had one of these stoves in the middle of the church, for heat. And
A wood stove.
A wood stove in the middle of the church. And we had that old bell back here in
Sure.
the cabinet. It was just outside of the church there. And
Did they ring the bell to announce service?
no, I don't remember them
You
doing
think
that.
it's more ornamental than it was
Yeah,
practical?
it was more ornamental than anything. But somebody wanted the bell, and I believe Claude Carey gave them that bell, if I'm not mistaken. I believe he did. But anyway, we were a group of loving, caring people, and a lot of us had known each other for years, and we grew. It began to grow. The Lord blessed us, and we began to grow.
So you were fortunate enough to be involved with the organization of a church.
Absolutely. And Mom and Dad were, my Uncle Leon, and my Aunt Annie. That's my mother's brother and his wife. They lived down the street where Miss Jane lives now.
Would their last name be Robinson?
Robinson, Leon and Annie Robinson. And then they were charter members. My mom and dad were charter members. But I decided then, right then and there, that I would get my letter and move to the church. So I got my letter, and by the next meeting day, myself, Ray and Wilma Smith, and Mr. and Mrs. Sam Taylor united with the church.
So this is 2021, and you joined this church in 1950.
Mhm.
So you've been a member here for
A long time.
a long time. Notice you said a long time.
Uh-huh.
Uh,
It's
I'll-
very dear to my heart.
Well, I'm glad we didn't leave that out because that's prompted me to want to do a video or two just about the organization of this church, because Janet and I were fortunate enough to be involved in that at County Line Missionary Baptist Church back in 1987 into 1988. And that's a blessing because of, just for so many reasons, it's a blessing to go through that.
Well, if you don't mind me saying this, when we organized the church, of course, they set up the pastor and the clerk and the,
Right.
on the organizational day, of course, Brother Robert Knowles was elected pastor. And let's see, I believe it was Brother Knowles that asked me if I would copy the rules of order or whatever, let's see, no, that's not what they call it. Anyway, the documents that you have for the organization of the church, what you believe and so forth, and the covenant and all that. So we borrowed the minutes from Concord Missionary Baptist Church. They let us borrow their old minutes. And I copied all of that down and wrote that down for the church. And we've got those documents still.
So, see, I thought, Miss Ann, you've been the secretary here for just
About 20 years.
20 years. But in actuality, you've been,
I've been
in
involved
some form or
with-
fashion, you've been the secretary here since
With-
1950.
Well, that was secretarial duties that I did for that. I got those documents together for the church. Probably and any other time I could tell you, and in next week I could probably tell you what it's called. But it's the, not
Articles
rules
of Faith.
Articles of Faith. That's it, Johnny. The Articles of
Right.
Faith. They copied all of that down and everything so that we'd have our own, and then they started the minutes from there. Of course, we had another man who was the clerk that took the actual minutes, but then pretty soon Ray Smith became clerk.
Right.
And has been ever since. There was something I wanted to interject in there, and what was it? Oh, when you were talking about me being involved with it, I was also one of the first piano players.
Well, we're going to get into that in a little bit.
Okay.
But being you brought up when you started your secretarial duties here at the church, I meant to cover this in the very beginning, but I failed to. What all do you do here at the church now and have been doing? What are some of your responsibilities?
Well, well,
There's several. I can tell you there's several of them.
Well, I keep a record of all of the minutes. I type those up for a permanent record. I went back when I first became secretary here, when I retired and came back, I typed all of the old minutes up from the beginning until now, so that we have all of our records on digital.
Right.
I mean, we can access that. We
Right.
can search that any way we want to, because now we have all of that. And we also have hard copies of a lot. Some of it was difficult because Ray Smith was the clerk, and he had kept the documents in a safe at his business, and it caught fire and did burn a few of it, but most of them were saved. I mean, it's kind of scorched around the edges, but you could
Really?
make it out,
Right.
decipher it. But anyway, I did that. Well, now I still help Ray in taking notes for him at business meeting. He's not quite as fast as that as he used to be. I take the minute notes and type those up for him and get them ready for the next minute. Okay, I do all of the correspondence, welcome cards, pastor's correspondence, that type of thing. I keep the federal records that we have to keep and submit for employees and for other workers at the church. I do that. I try to keep the library and document those and organize the library at the church. I videotape the sermons and the Bible studies and edit those, and actually Barry and Stanley help me with the videography at times. And then where they're edited, I stopped making DVDs because people aren't asking for them anymore, but I made DVDs of the sermons and special programs that we had. I make CDs. And then my son, I give him the MP3s for the CDs, and he puts them on the website. My son and I have done the website, or did the website. One of the first things I did, even before I came back, was they were collecting the personal testimonies of members, and they were putting some on the back of the bulletin and so forth. And I said, I would really like to keep a record of all of this. So I started, even back then, making a book with a picture and the personal testimony of that person that submitted that. And then my son, I said, I wish this was published some way for you. He said, why don't you put it, make a website? That's how the website got started. Why don't you do a website and put them all on the website? So that's how that came to be.
So
we had the book first, and then...
So where are these testimonies at exactly? On the church website?
On the church website. Mm-hmm.
You can go and find church members that have put them out there, their own testimonies of salvation.
Mm-hmm.
I would encourage all of our church members, if you hadn't done that, to
go through and read them. Now, it's been out there a good many years,
right.
So some of the pictures may be
need updated.
Need updated, but they're there, and that's how that got started. And from the website, then we added videos, MP3s, and other things. Really, it needs updating right now, but I just don't have time to do it.
So in a nutshell, you're church secretary, videographer,
Webmaster.
Webmaster. I don't think of Miss Ann and webmaster in the same sentence, but I guess I just did. Organ player, which we hadn't talked about music yet, but we're going to. So obviously Miss Ann wears a lot of hats here at our church, and you notice I don't call her Sister Ann. I probably should, but I'm so used to calling her Miss Ann. Our pastor calls her that and everybody else, but that's strictly out of affection for Miss Ann.
It's strange. Everybody used to call me Ann, and then I got old and everybody started calling me Miss Ann.
Well, Miss Ann, I've noticed more younger people calling me Mr. McClure, so we'll just have to